Welcome to Texas, the petrol state. Right here is the Permian Basin. In 2022, more than half of the oil produced in the US came from here. But zoom in, and between the oil wells, there is a peculiar rectangle. It's a facility that started construction at the end of 2022, called DAC 1. It's scheduled to begin operating in 2024 with a bit of a strange goal for the state: to fight global warming. But the company behind DAC 1 has already significantly contributed to climate change. It's the oil company Occidental Petroleum, or Oxy. Over the past 10 years, the company has received permits to drill nearly 3,000 wells in Texas. But Oxy has decided to try and tackle high CO2 levels in the atmosphere through a simple method. Draw in the air, extract the carbon dioxide, and release the clean air back into the atmosphere. This is called direct air capture, or DAC, and it's not only Oxy who's interested in this. European aerospace giant Airbus has already purchased the removal of 400,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere with DAC 1. There's no doubt for Oxy that DAC is a vital technology, and it says it wants to have some 100 DAC plants online by 2035. The question is, will direct air capture really save us from global warming? First, we must take a look at how DAC works. In terms of DAC 1, giant fans blow air against a filter. Chemicals help trap CO2 in the filter, and the clean air is then released. Depending on the filter used, what happens next can change slightly, but heating the filter to detach and recover the CO2 is always required. The CO2 then needs to be compressed for it to be transported. This method has several advantages. First, the size. DAC 1 requires about 20 hectares of land, or the equivalent of around 30 soccer fields. Capturing the same amount of CO2 by planting trees would require 80,000 hectares, so 4,000 times more land than DAC 1. DAC also keeps pure CO2, which can then be transformed or stored. It can be injected into underground reservoirs to sequester it for years. According to Oxy's initial announcements, the facility should eventually remove 1 million tons of CO2 per year, the equivalent to the annual carbon footprint of 110,000 French people. Some DAC plants are already present, but on a much smaller scale, with the most advanced ones expected to remove 4,000 tons of CO2 from the atmosphere each year. DAC 1 would become the first installation to reach industrial quantities. But the plant's effect would be small compared to the emissions attributed to Oxy, and very, very small compared to human emissions. But Oxy doesn't want to settle for DAC 1.
Oxy announced its objective to develop up to 70 to 135 plants by 2035. DAC will play a key role in Oxy's net zero pathway.
Oxy has justified its infatuation with DAC at every turn, pointing to the IEA, the International Energy Agency. The IEA released its net zero emission roadmap in 2021. It sets out to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. Their report says that humans must emit less CO2 by 2050 to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To reach this goal, The organisation has proposed using different policy tools, each varying in levels of importance. The deployment of renewable energy would make it possible to avoid 35% of emissions. Efficiency gains due to technological progress account for a 13% reduction. Our individual behavioural changes account for an 11% reduction, with DAC right here, between 1 and 2%. Not quite the vital technology that Oxy boasts. Still, the IEA has made an optimistic bet. While DAC 1 is not yet operational, it says that the equivalent of 90 similar projects could be in action by 2030, and 1,000 by 2050. But capturing CO2 directly from the air requires a lot of energy and therefore a lot of money. With current technologies, if DAC plant deployment reaches levels proposed by the IEA, it would require in 2050 4 to 10 exajoules of energy per year. In 2021, France consumed 10 exajoules of primary energy. And then there's the financial cost. Oxy has already invested $1.1 billion to build DAC 1. The company estimates that capturing and sequestering a ton of CO2 will cost between $400 and $500. Costs which they hope to have for future installations.
You have to remember that DAC is still a relatively immature technology. For now, these are still very expensive methods. But again, we're dealing with small volume. We're also hoping for an economy of scale afterward.
To cushion costs, Oxy can sell carbon credits as planned with Airbus and use the captured CO2 to perform enhanced oil recovery. This method involves injecting CO2 into an oil well to increase its yield. According to Oxy, this increases the amount of oil recovered by 10 to 25%. Oxy can also count on the support of the US government, which is committed to subsidizing the tons of CO2 captured with tax credits. By $130 per ton of captured CO2 if they're using for oil and gas extraction, and by $180 for other geologically sequestered CO2. If DAC 1 works as advertised, Oxy could be exempted of $130 to $180 million in taxes per year. And if the measure is still in place in 2032 and Oxy meets its targets, this would go up to between $3 billion and $4.5 billion a year. In the face of the climate emergency, it's not out of the ordinary to invest these kinds of sums in a company as polluting as Oxy to help it achieve its energy transition. The problem is that despite its investments in DAC, Oxy has not meaningfully engaged in a green transition. The IEA highlighted that DAC can only play a secondary role in helping reduce emissions. And like the IPCC, the IEA is clear on how they envision these reductions to play out. Oil production at 100 million barrels per day in 2022 must fall by about 28% by 2030. CO2 emissions must fall by 50% by 2030 from their 2019 level. And new investment in fossil fuels must be stopped now. But Oxy has not announced any targets for reducing its oil production. Its objective for 2032 is essentially to remove 25 million tons of CO2 from the atmosphere per year via DAC, meaning a 10% reduction in its emissions. In 2021, Oxy invested $252 million for fossil fuel exploration. In the end, no, DAC won't solve all our problems, but it could help to a limited extent.
Si on veut arriver à net zéro et que
If we want to get to net zero, and there are still sectors that are difficult to decarbonize, we can think about cement, steel, sectors like
si on
aviation.
veut continuer à avoir des avions, il restera quelques émissions.
The only way to neutralize those emissions is to remove the CO2 molecules that were emitted from the atmosphere.
Enlever les molécules de CO2 de l'atmosphère qui ont été émises.
It will not be clear if DAC is an appropriate response to climate change until it's developed. The IEA says that in this decade, $8 billion needs to be invested in development, and $36 billion in 2030, and $43 billion in 2040. But the main task is to reduce emissions.
L'élimination du carbone n'est pas
This is the most expensive and stupid way to try to lower our net
la
emissions.
plus stupide d'essayer de baisser les émissions nettes.
If we lower the emissions, these technologies will be a waste of energy and money for nothing.
Pour rien, on peut pas grand-chose.
The problem is that Oxy is not the only one focusing on DAC. Businesses that have invested in the company behind DAC 1 include Airbus, BHP, the world's largest mining company, and Chevron, another oil company. In 2021, Chevron spent $549 million on fossil fuel exploration. The following year, the company's executive board wrote to its shareholders.
Regarding the sale of our products, we believe that an absolute Scope 3 target is incompatible with our strategy. That includes increasing our oil and gas production.